The rain had stopped 20 minutes ago, but Brookdale Park still looked like a battlefield. Puddles, the size of dinner tables, stretched across the walking paths. Mud, thick, dark, and relentless, clung to everything it touched. The oak trees dripped steadily, their leaves heavy and bowed. The air smelled like wet earth and rotting leaves. Ava Taylor sat frozen in her wheelchair at the edge of the main pathway, staring down at the muddy trap that had swallowed her front wheels. She was 10 years old, small for her age. Her hands gripped the wheel rims so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Come on," she whispered. "Please." She pushed. The wheels didn't budge. The mud was thick, almost alive. It had pulled her in the moment she tried to navigate around a puddle, and now it held her like quicksand. The more she struggled, the deeper the wheels sank. Her arms trembled. She pushed again, harder. Nothing. Her breath came faster. Panic crept up her spine like ice water. She twisted in her seat, looking back toward the bench where she had last seen Ms. Reed, her nanny. There she was, 30 meters away, leaning against the armrest, phone pressed to her ear, perfectly dry under the park's covered pavilion. Ava called out to her, her voice thin and desperate. "Ms. Reed, please." The woman didn't even look up. Ava's heart sank. She could hear Ms. Reed's voice, casual and unbothered, carrying across the empty space between them. "I don't know, Janet. She's fine. She always makes everything so dramatic," Ms. Reed continued, letting out a short laugh. "She needs to learn some independence, you know? Can't have someone running after her every 5 minutes. She's got to figure things out on her own." The words hit Ava like a slap. She stared at the woman's back, willing her to turn around, to see her, to care. But Ms. Reed just shifted her weight and kept talking. "Honestly, sometimes I think she does it on purpose for attention." Ava's throat burned. She turned away, blinking hard against the tears that threatened to spill over. "Fine," she whispered to herself. "I'll find help somewhere else." A woman in a pink jogging suit appeared, earbuds in, moving at a steady pace. Ava called out to her. "Excuse me," she croaked. "I need help." The jogger glanced over, eyes meeting Ava's for just a moment. Then the woman looked away and kept running. "Please." Ava tried again, louder this time. "I need help." The woman didn't stop, didn't even slow down. Her ponytail swung behind her as she disappeared around the bend. Ava's chest tightened. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The park was full of people, dog walkers, joggers, families with strollers, and yet she was completely alone. Her breathing quickened. Her chest felt tight. The sounds around her faded into a dull hum. Just her heartbeat pounding in her ears and the ragged pull of air in and out of her lungs. She looked down at the mud swallowing her wheels. It felt like the world itself was pulling her under, and no one cared enough to reach down and pull her back up. Behind her, Ms. Reed laughed at something on the phone. Ava's hands went limp in her lap. And then, in the distance, at the far edge of the park, a figure appeared. A boy, teenage, tall and lean, wearing a dark green work uniform with a name tag Ava couldn't read from this far away. He was walking fast, head down, a plastic grocery bag swinging from one hand. Dylan Taylor was exhausted. His shift at Rivermart had run 2 hours overtime because someone called in sick and the manager begged him to stay. He'd said yes. He always said yes because his grandmother needed the money for her medications, and the rent was due in 3 days. He was 15 years old, but he felt 30. His feet ached in his worn-out sneakers. His green work uniform was damp with sweat and smelled faintly of disinfectant and old produce. The plastic grocery bag in his hand, 2 cans of soup, and a loaf of bread felt heavier than it should. All he wanted was to get home, take off his shoes, sit down for 5 minutes. But then he saw her. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, a small figure near the pathway. Something about the way she sat perfectly still, shoulders hunched, made him slow his pace. He squinted. A wheelchair stuck in the mud and a little girl alone, her hands gripping the wheels like she was holding on for dear life. Dylan stopped walking. His brain registered everything in an instant. The mud swallowing the wheels, the way her body trembled, the people passing by without stopping. His chest tightened. He looked down at the bag in his hand. then at his phone in his pocket, and then at his shoes, the only pair he owned that weren't falling apart. Everything was going to get soaked. He looked back at the girl. She was crying now. He could see it even from here. Dylan dropped the bag and ran. His sneakers hit the wet pavement hard, water splashing up with every step. The cold air burned his lungs, but he didn't slow down. He cut across the grass through puddles, past a dog walker who yelled something he didn't hear. The girl looked up as he approached her, eyes wide and red-rimmed. "Hey," Dylan said, breathing hard. "Hey, it's okay. I'm here." She stared at him like she didn't believe he was real. He dropped to his knees in front of her, ignoring the mud soaking through his uniform pants. Up close, he could see how deep the wheels were buried. The mud was thick, almost clay-like, and it had formed a suction around the rubber. "Okay," he muttered more to himself than to her. "Okay, let's get you out of here." He grabbed the metal frame of the wheelchair and pulled. Nothing. He braced his feet and pulled harder, his muscles straining. The chair didn't budge. "Come on," he hissed through clenched teeth. He tried pushing instead, rocking the chair back and forth to break the suction. The wheels shifted slightly but sank deeper with each movement. "Damn it. Shit," he muttered. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice so small he almost didn't hear it. "You tried. It's okay." Dylan looked at her, really looked at her. She was maybe 10 years old, soaked to the bone, shivering. Her face was streaked with mud and tears, but her eyes, God, her eyes were filled with the kind of resignation that no kid should ever have, like she was used to being left behind. Something twisted in Dylan's chest. "No," he said firmly. "It's not okay." He yanked off his work jacket and tossed it aside. Then he crouched down in front of her, his hands hovering near her arms. "I'm going to pick you up," he said. "Get you out of this chair and onto dry ground. Is that okay?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, on three." Before he could finish, a man in a gray suit was striding toward them, his face twisted in alarm. He was middle-aged, balding with a briefcase swinging from one hand like a weapon. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Dylan straightened up slightly, but kept his position near the girl. "I'm helping her," he said evenly. "She's stuck." "Don't touch her," the man shouted. His voice was sharp, authoritative. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting between Dylan and the girl. "Do you know who she is?" "Her father is Ethan Williams, the Ethan Williams billionaire." Dylan's grip on the girl's wheelchair tightened, but his voice was calm. "I'm just trying to help her." The man's eyes narrowed. "You lay one hand on her, and you'll have a lawsuit so fast." "She's scared." "She's scared," Dylan repeated quietly, his gaze not leaving the girl. "And I can't just stand here and watch." The man in the suit opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced around nervously, looking for backup. "Look, kid," he said, his tone slightly softer now. "I get it, but this is a bad idea." "Her father," Dylan interrupted, his voice quiet but firm. "You don't want to get involved with people like that." Dylan met the man's eyes with quiet resolve. "I'm already involved." The man shook his head, muttering something under his breath. He pulled out his phone and started walking away, glancing back over his shoulder. "Your funeral, kid," he called out. Dylan watched him go, then turned back to the girl. A few other people had stopped now, forming a loose circle at a safe distance, watching, recording on their phones, whispering to each other. But not helping, never helping. "Ignore them," Dylan said softly to the girl. "Ready?" She nodded, eyes locked on his. He slid his arms under her legs and back, lifting her with surprising ease, though the mud sucked at his shoes as he straightened. "I've got you," he murmured. "I've got you." The mud sucked at Dylan's shoes with every step, each one feeling like he was pushing against a weight too heavy to bear. His arms burned from the strain, his legs trembling beneath him as the girl clung to him, her small hands gripping his neck like a lifeline. But he didn't stop. His breath came in ragged gasps, cold raindrops pelting his face, soaking through his clothes. The rain had started again, light at first, just a drizzle, but it quickly grew heavier, drenching everything in its path. The cold drops hit his skin, sharp, relentless. But still, Dylan kept moving, his body screaming, but his determination stronger than ever. He took one step, then another, each one feeling like trudging through thick mud, but he didn't stop. The girl was clutched tightly against him, shivering, but not from the cold. No, her trembling was a quiet desperation, one that had been building for far too long. "You're okay," Dylan whispered, though he could feel her body shaking, her small frame pressing against him, making him feel even more determined to get her safety. "Thank you," the girl whispered, her voice breaking as she pressed her face into his soaked shirt. Dylan felt his chest tighten at the words. "You're welcome," he muttered, but inside, he felt something stir, something more than just relief. It was a feeling he couldn't quite describe, like this moment meant something bigger than just helping her out of the mud. Finally, after what felt like forever, Dylan stepped off the mud-soaked path and onto solid ground. His knees buckled slightly as he steadied himself, but he didn't stop. The world around him slowed, the rain pouring down like a shower of stars, streaking across the dim light. The girl's grip tightened around his neck, and Dylan felt her breath hitch, like she was trying not to cry. He swallowed the lump in his throat, wanting to say something, anything to make it better, but he couldn't find the words. "You're okay now," he said softly, more to reassure himself than her. She pulled back just enough to look at him, her face streaked with mud and tears, but her eyes were filled with something new, something that hadn't been there when he first saw her. Gratitude, hope, trust. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time more firmly. "You saved me." Dylan didn't know how to respond. What he had done felt so simple, so natural. He didn't think about it. He didn't hesitate. She needed help, so he helped. But hearing her say it, it changed everything. A small crowd had gathered now, people on their phones, whispering, some with pitying glances, others recording the moment for their social media feeds. Dylan ignored them, focusing solely on the girl in his arms, who was still holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing in a world that kept shifting beneath her. "Thank you," she repeated, her voice cracking. "You didn't have to, but you did." Dylan didn't know how to respond. He'd helped her because it was the right thing to do. That was all. But her words, they stuck with him. "You're welcome," he said quietly, though his voice didn't feel strong. He wanted to say more, but what could he say? That he didn't expect to feel this way? That helping her had made him feel seen, somehow? "Can I help you?" A voice interrupted. Dylan turned to see a man approaching, tall, well-dressed in a suit, his expression one of concern, though his eyes were still scanning the scene with suspicion. "I'm fine," Dylan said quickly, turning his focus back to the girl in his arms. "Are you sure?" The man looked at him with narrowed eyes. "Because you just helped my daughter, and I need to know exactly what happened here." The man's words hit Dylan like a slap. He looked down at the girl, who was still holding on to him. She looked up at him, her wide, tear-filled eyes searching his face for some kind of reassurance. "I'm sorry," Dylan said, his voice tight. "I was just helping. She got stuck in the mud and You touched her." The man's voice was low, dangerous. Dylan stepped back, feeling the weight of the man's words. "She was stuck. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Do you know who she is?" The man's voice grew sharper, more urgent. "This is Ava Williams. Her father is David Williams, billionaire CEO of Williams Enterprises. Do you have any idea what you're doing? This could ruin everything." Dylan stood his ground, not backing down. "She was stuck. I was helping her. That's all." The man looked at him, then at Ava, who was still trembling in his arms. He paused, like he was weighing something inside. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter, more controlled. "I don't know what your game is, but you better get away from her. I'll handle it from here." Dylan didn't say another word. His eyes flicked toward Ava, who was still staring up at him. She reached out with one trembling hand, catching his wrist. "Don't go," she whispered. Dylan froze. The man in the suit opened his mouth, but Ava spoke first. "It's okay," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "He helped me. I'm not going anywhere. Not until he's sure I'm okay." The man didn't argue, but Dylan could see the hesitation in his eyes. Something shifted in the air between them, something unsaid but understood. Dylan wasn't sure what it meant, but he knew that in this moment his simple act of kindness had changed everything. The park was silent now, save for the soft pitter-patter of the rain, which had begun to ease into a steady drizzle. The people who had gathered to watch had slowly dispersed, some still whispering, others with their phones held high, but none of them offered any help. Dylan stood there, his legs stiff from carrying Ava through the mud, her fragile body still pressed against his chest, as if she hadn't let go since the moment he lifted her. A few steps away, her father, David Williams, was on the phone, his face drawn, fingers pinched tight around the device. Ava's expression, however, had softened since she'd looked at him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Dylan felt like he could breathe, but only for a second before David walked toward them, his gaze focused and sharp. "Is she okay?" David's voice was strained, barely concealing the anxiety bubbling beneath. His eyes flicked over Ava and then landed on Dylan. I was helping her," Dylan said quickly, hoping the man would see that he meant no harm. "She got stuck in the mud and David's eyes darted to the wet shoes, the mud-soaked uniform, and then back at his daughter, who was clinging to Dylan, still trembling from a cold. His brow furrowed, the suspicion lingering. But then something in his expression shifted. There was recognition there, something deeper than just concern. David took a step back, his posture relaxing just a fraction. He looked down at Ava, who had her head down, her hands still wrapped tightly around Dylan's wrist, not letting go. "She was stuck," Dylan repeated. "No one else stopped. I just helped." David took a long, deep breath, and then, unexpectedly, his shoulders dropped slightly. He glanced back at Miss Cooper, who had stood off to the side, watching with the same detached look she had since the beginning. He let out a sigh, then turned back to Dylan. "I'm sorry," David said, his voice quieter now, with a hint of shame creeping through. "I reacted badly." He looked at his daughter, and then back at the teenager, who was clearly soaked through and covered in mud. "You did the right thing." Dylan didn't know what to say. He had expected more anger, more accusations. But David's apology, genuine as it was, caught him off guard. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, but nodded in response, feeling his body finally relax, just a little. "Thank you," David said, his voice softening. "I'll make sure you're properly recognized for this." His eyes flicked down to Ava, who was still looking up at Dylan with those wide, trusting eyes. "But for now, let's get you both out of the rain." Dylan glanced at the bench where Miss Cooper still stood, her phone now firmly glued to her ear, her posture unmoving. The feeling of being completely dismissed was something Dylan knew too well. And yet, in this moment, he didn't care, because for the first time, someone had seen him, not just as the help, but as someone capable of doing the right thing. And, somehow, that changed everything. Ava's voice, small but firm, broke through his thoughts. "Thank you," she whispered, her hands still holding onto him. "You saved me." Dylan smiled faintly, his heart swelling with something he hadn't expected, pride. Not the kind of pride that came from accomplishments or accolades, but the kind that came from knowing he had made a real difference in someone's life. David cleared his throat, and Dylan's attention snapped back to him. "Look, we need to get you both somewhere dry. I have a car waiting. Let's go." He turned to Miss Cooper. "Get her wheelchair." Now, for a moment, Miss Cooper hesitated, still speaking in her phone, but she complied, walking over to the mud where the wheelchair sat half-buried. As she reached down to retrieve it, David's voice cut through the air again. "You'll get the wheelchair," he said, voice steady. "And then you're done. We'll discuss your future with my family later." Dylan could see Miss Cooper's face falter, but she said nothing. She turned and walked quickly toward the mud, her heels clicking against the pavement. Ava's grip on Dylan's wrist tightened. "Don't go yet," she whispered, her voice cracking with vulnerability. Dylan turned to her, her eyes pleading with him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I promised." Ava's face softened, and for a brief moment, it was as if the weight of the world had lifted off her shoulders. The rain continued to fall around them, but this time it wasn't as cold, not as isolating. Dylan had stayed, and that small act of staying had shifted something between them, something deeper than just help. The air in the car was thick with tension, but it wasn't the kind of tension that made Dylan uncomfortable. It was the kind that came from people genuinely trying to do right by each other. The sound of the rain against the windows was the only constant as the luxury car rumbled along the winding streets of the city, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. Ava sat beside him, still wrapped in her jacket, but now with a warm blanket draped over her. Her face, once pale from the cold, was slowly returning to its natural color, the faintest traces of a smile beginning to tug at the corners of her lips. Dylan glanced at her and felt something stir inside, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel for a long time. Hope. David sat across from them, his posture stiff but his eyes reflecting something deeper than just the usual coldness of a businessman. Ava had been quiet since they'd left the park, her gaze fixed out the window, watching the city blur past. Dylan wasn't sure if it was the rain or just the weight of everything that had happened in the past hour, but the silence between them felt comfortable, not awkward. Then, David spoke, breaking the quiet. "Look," he began, his voice measured, "I owe you a debt I can never fully repay." Dylan blinked, surprised at the admission. He wasn't used to hearing words like that from someone with David's stature. "I didn't ask for anything," Dylan said quickly, unsure where this conversation was headed. He wasn't here to be rewarded. He had simply done what anyone should have done. "I know," David continued, his eyes meeting Dylan's, "but that doesn't change the fact that you helped my daughter when no one else would. You didn't hesitate. You just saw a girl in need, and you helped. That's something rare, and I don't take it lightly." Dylan shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't done it for the praise. He hadn't even thought of it as anything other than the right thing to do. But hearing David speak like this, it made it feel different somehow. Dylan started but stopped himself. He didn't know what to say. "I just wanted to help." David's expression softened. "I get that," he said, looking at Ava briefly before turning back to Dylan. "But sometimes, helping someone can change your life in ways you never expect." Dylan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" David took a breath, his fingers drumming lightly on the leather seat. "I think you've earned more than just a thank you." Dylan blinked again, his confusion mounting. "What are you talking about?" Ava turned to look at him now, her eyes bright, but there was something else there, something he couldn't quite place. "You've changed things today," David said. "For Ava, for me, for all of us. And I want to make sure you're properly taken care of." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. "I'm fine, really. I don't need anything." David shook his head, leaning forward slightly, his tone serious. "This isn't charity, Dylan. It's more than that. You've shown a level of character that I admire, and I want to help you. Help you in a way that might actually make a difference." Dylan swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. "I'm not looking for a handout. I'm not offering a handout," David interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm offering an opportunity, a chance to better your life, to make sure your future is secure." Dylan's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" David paused, giving him a long, assessing look. Then he pulled out a sleek, dark envelope from his briefcase. "I want to offer you something, Dylan. Something you didn't ask for, but I think you deserve." He handed the envelope to Dylan, who hesitated before taking it. His fingers grazed the smooth surface, the weight of it more than just the paper inside. He opened the envelope slowly, pulling out a business card. It was simple, elegant. Everything about it screamed wealth and power. And yet it felt real, unpretentious. "Consider this a proposal," David said, his voice low. "A job at Anderson Enterprises. A paid internship. After school, 3 days a week. It's a start, minimum wage, but with room to grow. If you prove yourself, there's more where that came from." Dylan's heart pounded. He didn't understand. Why was David offering this to him? "You don't even know me." David's eyes met his, and for the first time, Dylan saw something other than cold calculation in them. There was sincerity there, a raw honesty that made Dylan's chest tighten. "I know more than you think," David said quietly. "You don't do what you did today for a reward, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve one. This isn't about money. It's about recognizing your potential." Dylan was stunned. His hand shook slightly as he held the business card in his hand, unsure of what to say. This wasn't the life he'd planned for, and yet here it was, staring him in the face, an opportunity that seemed too big to pass up. David's voice broke through his thoughts again. "And that's not all," he continued, his tone shifting slightly. "I also want to help with your grandmother's medical bills. I can't imagine what you've had to go through, juggling everything. Let me take that burden off your shoulders. Dylan's breath caught in his throat. You don't have to do that. I want to, David insisted, his gaze steady. Consider it part of the opportunity. I'm offering you a chance to change your life, Dylan, to secure your future. No strings attached. The car slowed as they approached a stoplight, and the sound of the rain hitting the windows seemed louder, as if the whole world was waiting for Dylan's answer. He looked at Ava, who was watching him with those wide, hopeful eyes. This was a moment he had never imagined would come, and now that it had, he didn't know if he was ready. But then he thought of his grandmother, of the long hours he'd worked to make ends meet, of the fear that gripped him every time he wondered what would happen if she didn't get the care she needed, the tears she tried to hide, the moments when he couldn't do enough. This was more than an opportunity for him. It was a chance for them both, a chance to breathe, to live, to not have to struggle just to survive. Dylan took a deep breath, his hands steadying as he looked back at David. Okay, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll take it. David's face lit up with a smile, and for the first time in a long time, Dylan felt something he hadn't expected, a sense of relief. As the car turned down the street, heading toward his apartment, he looked down at the business card in his hand, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. He wasn't just surviving anymore. This was the beginning of something new. The next day, Dylan couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief that clung to him as he walked through the familiar streets, the ones he'd known his whole life. He'd barely slept the night before, his mind racing with the possibilities David's proposal had opened up for him. An internship at Anderson Enterprises, a chance to work for one of the most successful companies in the city. His grandmother, Ruth, had been asleep when he'd gotten home last night. He didn't want to wake her up with the news just yet. He needed time to process it himself. But when he walked through the door that morning, she was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping her tea. The smell of oatmeal filled the air. "How'd it go?" she asked, her voice warm but knowing. She'd always been able to tell when something was different, when something had changed in his life. Dylan sat down across from her, his hands resting on the table. "It went well," he said, his voice low. "Better than well. I think I might have just changed my life." Ruth put down her mug and leaned forward slightly, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "What happened?" He hesitated, still trying to find the right words for everything that had occurred. But there was no way to make this sound anything less than incredible. "David Anderson offered me a job," Dylan said, his voice still in awe of the words as they left his mouth. Ruth blinked, surprised but not shocked. She had seen the way the Andersons had looked at him, the gratitude in their eyes when he helped Ava. She had always known Dylan had the kind of character that would attract attention, but this was more than either of them could have expected. "That's incredible," Ruth whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "But what about your grandmother's medical bills?" Dylan shook his head. "That's the other thing. He wants to help with that too. It's not just a job. It's everything. He's offering to cover the bills, all of it, so I don't have to work 2 jobs just to keep up." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she picked up her tea again. "Dylan, do you understand what this means?" "I don't know," Dylan admitted, looking down at the table. "It's a lot to take in. I don't know if I deserve it." Ruth smiled softly. "You deserve it more than you think. You've worked hard for so long. It's time you let someone else help. This could be the fresh start you've been waiting for." Dylan didn't know what to say. Ruth's words were like a balm to the doubts that had been swirling in his mind. He had always prided himself on doing things on his own, but maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to let go of that burden. As the days passed, Dylan and Ruth talked more about the opportunity. The more they discussed it, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a job or a scholarship. It was about a chance to build something better, something more than just surviving. On the 4th day, when the offer was finally confirmed, Dylan stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment, adjusting the collar of his shirt. His phone buzzed on the table, and he picked it up to see a message from David Anderson. "Excited to have you join us tomorrow. We'll be meeting at the office around 10 a.m. Look forward to seeing you there." Dylan couldn't believe this was happening. It wasn't just a job offer. It was the beginning of everything he had ever wanted, a future he could shape for himself and for Ruth. A future where they wouldn't have to struggle just to survive. The next morning, Dylan arrived at the gleaming Anderson Tower. The building rose above him, towering and majestic, a symbol of everything he had never imagined he would be a part of. The revolving doors were so polished they reflected his nervous face back at him. He stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath before walking in. Inside, the lobby was massive, sleek, and impossibly modern. He had never been in a place like this before. The floors were marble, the walls covered in abstract art. The air smelled like luxury, clean, fresh, almost sterile. A receptionist greeted him with a warm smile and guided him to the elevator. The ride up to the 15th floor felt surreal, as if he was ascending into another world entirely. When the doors opened, a woman in a sharp suit was waiting for him. "Mr. Johnson," she said with a smile, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Chun, Mr. Anderson's executive assistant. Follow me, please." Dylan nodded and followed her down the hall, trying to steady his breathing. He couldn't help but feel out of place here. He wasn't used to places like this. He wasn't used to being the person people noticed. But here, on this floor, he was expected. They reached a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows, and Patricia knocked softly before opening the door. "Mr. Anderson," she said, her voice carrying authority. "Dylan Johnson has arrived." David Anderson stood from behind his massive desk, smiling as he extended his hand. "Dylan, welcome. I'm glad you could make it." Dylan took his hand, shaking it firmly. "Thank you for having me." David gestured to the chair in front of him. "Please sit down. I wanted to have a conversation about what comes next." Dylan took a seat, his hands still slightly trembling. "What comes next?" he asked, his voice uncertain. David leaned back against the desk, his eyes thoughtful. "Well, first, I want you to know that the job is yours. But I want you to know something else, too. This is more than just a job offer. This is an opportunity for you to grow, to really learn what it means to succeed. I believe in you, Dylan." Dylan sat back in the chair, overwhelmed. "I don't know if I can live up to all of this." David's gaze softened. "You already have. You showed up when no one else would. You helped Ava when she needed it. That's more than most people ever do." Dylan looked down at his hands, still processing. "What if I can't do this? What if I mess up?" "You won't," David said firmly. "I have faith in you." A silence stretched between them before David spoke again, this time more quietly. "And there's one more thing." Dylan looked up, puzzled. "What's that?" David's expression turned serious. "I want to help with your grandmother's medical bills. I know you're doing everything you can, but it's not enough. You don't have to do this alone." Dylan felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, disbelief, but mostly relief. "You really mean that?" David nodded. "Absolutely. This is a chance for you to build a future. But you don't have to do it alone." Dylan's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. "Thank you. You don't know what this means to me." David smiled. "I do. I understand more than you think." Dylan left Anderson Tower that day with a heart full of mixed emotions. He had always been the kind of person who carried the weight of everything on his shoulders, but now it felt like the world was shifting beneath his feet. He was on the verge of something new, something bigger than he'd ever imagined. But with that new beginning came a heavy weight of expectation. That night, after he got back to his apartment, Ruth was waiting for him at the kitchen table. She didn't need to ask. The look on his face said everything. She could see it in his eyes. The same hope, the same uncertainty that had been there ever since the first day he'd brought her into that little apartment. "So," she asked, her voice steady but full of anticipation. Dylan sank into the chair opposite her, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the day. "It's real, Grandma. It's actually real." Ruth smiled, but it was a gentle, knowing smile. She had always believed in Dylan's potential, even when he didn't. "Tell me everything," she said softly, pouring him a cup of tea, her hands steady despite the weight of the conversation. Dylan went on to tell her about the internship, the scholarship, the medical help for her. The words spilled out of him, almost faster than he could process them. But it wasn't just about the opportunity. It was about the shift in how he saw his future. "I'm scared, Grandma," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I can live up to it. I don't know if I deserve all of this." Ruth's eyes softened as she leaned forward, placing a comforting hand over his. "You've always been the one to fight, to work for what you want. But this is different. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders anymore, Dylan. Let someone help you." Let them show you that you can accept kindness and still stay strong. Dylan didn't know what to say. He had always prided himself on being self-sufficient, on never asking for help. But this was different. Everything was changing, and he couldn't stop it. The next few days were a blur of activity. Dylan started his first day at Anderson Enterprises, still trying to wrap his mind around the reality of it. The office was everything he had imagined and more, sleek, polished, and full of high-powered people with impressive credentials. He felt out of place, but the more he worked, the more he realized that he was learning. Fast. The tasks he was given were simple, organizing files, entering data, but it wasn't the work that mattered. It was the feeling of being part of something bigger. For the first time in his life, Dylan felt like he belonged. But the most important thing was the relationship he was beginning to build with David Anderson. David wasn't just a billionaire boss. He was a mentor. Dylan had never had a father figure, not really, and David's steady guidance was something he had never expected to receive. David saw him, not as a charity case, but as someone with promise, someone worth investing in. One afternoon, about a week into his new job, David called him into his office. Dylan knocked softly on the door, his heart racing. He had no idea what this meeting was about, but something told him it was important. "Come in," David's voice called out from inside. Dylan stepped in, trying to calm the nerves that were suddenly clawing at his chest. David looked up from the papers in front of him and smiled. "I wanted to check in with you," he said, motioning to the chair across from him. "How are you settling in?" Dylan sat down, feeling like he was still adjusting to the whirlwind of his life. "I'm doing well. It's a lot to take in, but I'm getting the hang of it." David nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "Good. But there's something else I want to talk to you about. I've been thinking about your situation, your grandmother's medical bills, your future, and I wanted to offer something more." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. "More?" he asked cautiously. David stood up from his desk and walked around to the other side. He leaned forward slightly, as if weighing the impact of his words. "I've been talking to my team, and we want to do more than just help with the bills. We want to offer you a full scholarship to any college or university of your choice. We'll cover everything: tuition, books, room and board. You deserve a future where you don't have to choose between working and going to school." Dylan sat there, stunned. The weight of the offer settled over him like a heavy blanket. "But why? Why me?" David looked at him, his gaze steady. "Because you showed me what really matters. You showed me that there's more to life than money and power. You've got the kind of character I respect, and I want to give you the chance to succeed, not just survive. You've already given me a lot of lessons in the short time you've been here." Dylan didn't know what to say. He had never expected anything like this. For the first time, he didn't feel like the world was against him. As he left the office that day, the weight in his chest had shifted. It wasn't just the offer of a scholarship. It wasn't just the job. It was the realization that his life was finally changing in ways he had never dreamed possible. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork, meetings, and late-night studying. Dylan was juggling his job at Anderson Enterprises with his high school classes, trying to stay afloat in a world that suddenly seemed full of opportunities, each one pulling him in a new direction. But with every challenge, he found himself growing more confident, more certain that he was on the right path. At work, his tasks had become more complex. He was now handling small projects, researching solutions to some of the company's IT issues, and even learning about data management and financial software. He'd spent late nights poring over code and troubleshooting systems, pushing his boundaries and learning faster than he ever had before. There was no time to relax, but there was no time for doubt either. Every day was another step toward his future. But it wasn't all work. David's mentorship had been invaluable, but there was something else growing between them: a bond. Dylan had come to realize that David wasn't just helping him professionally. He was becoming the father figure he'd always needed. They would have lunch together sometimes, just the two of them, discussing everything from business strategies to life lessons. Dylan never thought he'd have this kind of relationship with a man like David Anderson. But as the weeks passed, he saw a side to the billionaire that no one else did. A father, a mentor, a friend. But it was the weekends that truly began to mean something special. Every Saturday, Dylan would go with Leah and David to Brookdale Park. It became their tradition. They didn't go there to be seen or to make an impression. They went because it was their space where they could connect, laugh, and just be a family. Leia had become the little sister Dylan never had. She had a sharp wit and a mind full of questions, always wanting to know everything. And Malik? He was her hero. To her, he was the one who had rescued her from the mud, not just physically, but emotionally. He'd shown her what kindness really meant, and it was something she clung to. On one of those weekends, as the fall air turned crisp, Dylan and Leia sat on the bench where their story had begun, the one near the old oak tree that had witnessed everything. From the time Dylan had helped Leia out of the mud to now, when they were both carving out new futures. Leia was sitting taller these days. Her wheelchair was no longer just a symbol of her limitations, but a tool for independence, and that made her smile. "Do you think things would be different if I hadn't gotten stuck that day?" Leia asked, her voice soft, almost lost in the breeze. Dylan looked over at her, studying her face. It was different now, brighter, stronger. But she had come a long way since that rainy day in the park. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady, "things would be different. But I think it would have been different for both of us." Leia smiled a small, knowing smile. "I think so, too," she said, her eyes thoughtful. "But it's funny. I feel like I'm not stuck anymore." Dylan chuckled softly. "Yeah, I can see that." The quiet between them was comfortable. For the first time in a long time, Dylan didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was exactly where he needed to be, and that felt good. The sound of a car pulling up interrupted their peaceful moment. Dylan looked up to see David stepping out of the black Mercedes. His father, though they didn't call it that yet, had been good to his word. He was there for every step of Dylan's journey, and every time Dylan felt like he might fall, David was there to catch him. "Hey, you too," David called, his voice carrying across the park. "How's the view from over here?" Dylan grinned, standing up. "It's perfect," he said. "Just needed to take it all in." Leia wheeled herself forward, her smile lighting up her face as David approached. He bent down to her level, his voice gentle but teasing. "You're getting good at that, you know. It's like you've become a pro at this whole being a kid thing." Leia laughed. "Well, it's hard when you've got a lot of people showing you the ropes." David laughed as well, his eyes glinting with pride. "That's what I like to hear." He looked at Dylan, his gaze softening. "You've come a long way, kid." Dylan nodded, feeling something in his chest swell at the words. "I've got a good family to help me." David stepped back and looked around at the park. "Yeah, you do." That evening, as the three of them sat around the dinner table at David's house, Dylan couldn't help but feel like he was in a dream. The food was delicious, and the house was warm with the sound of laughter, but it was more than that. It was the way they were all together, a family, a real one. Later, when the table had been cleared and the night had settled in, David turned to Dylan, his expression serious but warm. "You know," David began, "I've been thinking. You got a good head on your shoulders. I'd like to help you with your next step. I can get you connected to some amazing people in the business world, some of the top executives in the city. But you've got to promise me one thing." Dylan raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "You got to promise me you won't let this success, this world, change who you are. You've got to stay true to yourself, Dylan. Don't lose the heart you've got." Dylan sat back in his chair, the weight of David's words sinking in. He had been working hard to build something, to make something of himself. But as he sat there, surrounded by people who truly cared for him, he realized that the world could throw all the success and wealth his way, but the most important thing he had, the thing he had always had, was his integrity. "I promise," Dylan said quietly, and for the first time, he believed it. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Dylan had moved past any hesitation he'd once felt. He was no longer just the boy who had helped a little girl in the mud. He was now a part of something bigger. He was carving out a future, one built on the lessons he had learned in the rain, with the support of people who believed in him. He had spent countless nights working on the all-terrain wheelchair project with Leia. Their prototype had evolved, and their hard work paid off when they were invited to present it at a national innovation fair. Though they didn't win first place, their project received recognition from medical technology companies, and the media took notice. Dylan was also thriving in his job at Anderson Enterprises. The internship had led to a full-time position after he graduated high school, and he was moving quickly through the ranks. With David's mentorship, he was learning how to handle both the technical and leadership aspects of the business, growing into the kind of person who could change the world. But it wasn't just work that defined his success. His relationship with Leia had deepened in a way that was impossible to ignore. They had become the closest of friends, partners, in a way. Together, they dreamed of changing the world. Their project, Will Beyond, was a massive success, and its impact extended far beyond what they ever imagined. One day, as they sat together in the park where it all started, Dylan turned to Leia, his mind buzzing with ideas. He was looking at her not just as the little girl he had helped, but as his equal, as the girl who had shaped him as much as he had helped her. "Have you ever thought about what we do next?" Dylan asked, glancing at her, unsure of how to phrase the question. Leia looked up at him, her wheelchair positioned at the edge of the path, as always. Her smile was a familiar warmth, and her eyes sparkled with the energy of someone who had only just begun to discover her own power. "Every day," she replied. "We keep going. We keep growing." Dylan grinned, the weight of their past struggles and triumphs pushing him forward. He realized just how much they had accomplished and how much more there was left to do. "I think you're right. But there's something else I've been thinking about." Leia turned to face him more fully, eager to hear his thoughts. What if we could start a foundation?" Dylan asked. "A place for people like you and me. People who've been overlooked, who've had to fight for their place in the world. What if we could give them the same chance that we had?" Leia's face lit up as she absorbed the idea. "I love it," she said immediately. "A place for people to be seen. A place where they don't have to hide their disabilities, their challenges, or their backgrounds. Where they could be empowered to thrive." It was then that Dylan knew they were onto something far bigger than any of their previous projects. They were about to change the world, not just with inventions, but with the power of connection, kindness, and inclusivity. A few years later, Malik Johnson, now a respected figure in both the tech and philanthropic worlds, stood at the front of a grand auditorium, his face beaming with pride. Beside him, Leia sat in her custom all-terrain wheelchair, her posture proud and strong. They had just completed the opening of their new foundation, one that would serve as a haven for individuals with disabilities and those who had faced adversity in any form. Wheel Beyond had evolved into something far greater than either of them had anticipated. As Dylan stood at the podium, addressing the room full of donors, volunteers, and well-wishers, he couldn't help but think back to the moment that had changed everything. The rain, the mud, the moment when he chose to run toward someone instead of walking away. That choice had led him here, to a life that was everything he had dreamed of and more. "To everyone who helped us along the way, thank you," Dylan said, his voice steady and full of emotion. "This isn't just our success. It belongs to all of us. To everyone who believed in us when we were stuck in the mud. To everyone who saw us, who gave us a chance. And to everyone who's still out there helping others. This foundation is for all of you." The crowd erupted into applause, and Dylan's gaze met Leia's. They shared a silent moment of understanding. They had made it, together. As the applause continued, Dylan whispered to himself, "We ran toward the mud." And it changed everything. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel for more thrilling, cinematic stories just like this one. What do you think? Can a single act of kindness really change the course of someone's life? Let us know where you're watching from and share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us about a time when helping someone made all the difference. We'd love to hear from you.